My brother invited us over for dinner, but when my husband and I showed up, he insisted I send my husband home. His reasoning? According to him, my husband doesn't belong in our family because he's just a dirty, uneducated cleaner. So, earlier this week, my husband and I went to Thanksgiving dinner at my brother's house. Let's call my brother Brandon. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. Brandon, who's 2 years older than me, and I used to be really close growing up. Honestly, we've stayed pretty friendly even as adults, until about 4 years ago. That's when I, 28F, started dating my husband, Nick, 30M. Brandon has never been okay with my relationship with Nick. It's not because Nick's a bad person. Far from it. Nick is kind, hardworking, and someone I'm genuinely happy with. Anyone who knows him would agree. But none of that seems to matter to Brandon. All he cares about is Nick's background. Nick comes from a very different upbringing than we do. He was raised by a single mom after his dad walked out as soon as he found out she was pregnant. To make things harder, Nick's mom didn't have any support. Her family cut her off because they disapproved of her decision to keep the baby. Despite all that, she pushed forward, determined to give Nick the best life she could. She worked tirelessly, and thanks to her dedication, Nick grew up to be an incredible person. Sure, Nick didn't grow up with money, but I actually think his story, and how he and his mom built their lives, is far more admirable than anything Brandon or I have done. My parents are both lawyers, so we had a pretty cushy, comfortable upbringing. But Brandon can't seem to get past the fact that Nick's background isn't like ours. In his eyes, Nick is somehow less than because of where he came from. That's ridiculous to me because Nick not only worked his way through college, but he's also now living a good, stable life while supporting his mom, who's retired. I honestly don't know what there isn't to respect about that. To me, he's stronger and more accomplished than most people I know. I've always hated how Brandon has treated Nick. From the moment I introduced Nick to my family, Brandon's attitude has been nothing but dismissive and weird. My parents? They've never had an issue with Nick. But Brandon? He's gone out of his way to belittle him with sly remarks and offhand comments, the kind that are designed to make someone feel small. I've confronted him about this many times. We've had arguments that have led to me cutting contact with him for weeks on end. Each time, Brandon would eventually apologize, promising that he'd change. And each time, I forgave him. But inevitably, he'd pull the same nonsense all over again. He was less than thrilled when Nick and I got engaged last year, and he certainly wasn't happy when we got married 6 months ago. Still, I held out hope that he'd come around eventually. I guess I was naive because, after what happened this Thanksgiving, I'm done. I don't think I'll ever speak to him again. There's just no coming back from this. Typically, Thanksgiving is hosted by my parents, but this year Brandon offered to host it at his place. He's actually a great cook, and since his wife is pregnant, he said he wanted the honor of having everyone over. He invited both Nick and me, even specifically mentioning that he wanted Nick there. We took it as a good sign. Maybe he was finally ready to give Nick a chance, so we accepted the invitation and showed up, having no idea what was about to happen. As soon as we arrived, Brandon greeted us at the door with a smile, for about 2 seconds. Then he turned to me and said, "You're welcome to come in, but Nick needs to go back home." I was stunned, and so was Nick. We just stood there, completely baffled. Then Brandon started explaining. Apparently, he and his wife had made a last-minute decision to invite her extended family, on top of his in-laws who were already coming. Because she's pregnant, she wanted to have a big gathering with all her relatives who rarely make it out to visit from the suburbs. What that had to do with Nick, I couldn't understand. But Brandon made it clear, Nick wasn't family enough to be included. The real issue was Brandon's in-laws, specifically his wife's extended family. With the exception of her parents, who are perfectly pleasant people, the rest of them are the type of snobs who seem to think being born into wealth makes them inherently superior. My sister-in-law is just as much of an elitist as Brandon, so it wasn't surprising that she looked down on Nick, too. I'd figured this out back at Brandon's wedding when I got my first real glimpse of her family. They're the kind of people who take pride in their fortune like it's a personal achievement rather than sheer luck. Standing at the door, Brandon told Nick and me, without a shred of shame, that he wanted Nick to leave. Why? Because it would be embarrassing for him to introduce Nick to his wife's family. He claimed they'd inevitably ask questions about Nick's background, and he just couldn't bear the humiliation. I was furious, absolutely livid. I didn't care who heard me as I started yelling at Brandon right there on his front porch. It was obvious he'd planned this whole thing just to humiliate Nick, and I wasn't going to let it slide. Even if he had made last-minute changes to the guest list, which I highly doubt, he could have just told us not to come. But no, he waited until we'd driven all the way to his place, just to pull this stunt and insult my husband to his face. I told him straight up that this was a calculated move to demean Nick and that it made him look classless. I knew that word, classless, would hit a nerve, and I wasn't wrong. Brandon's face turned bright red, and he snapped back almost instantly. "If you think I'm so classless," he said, "then you and your dirty, illiterate cleaner of a husband can leave my house." For context, Brandon's jab about Nick being a dirty, illiterate cleaner stems from the fact that Nick worked as a janitor at a local store during college. He juggled that job with several others so he could start paying off his student loans early. I've always thought that was admirable, nothing to be ashamed of. Calling Nick illiterate and dirty was just Brandon grasping at straws, spewing nonsense to try and tear him down. Nick is every bit as educated as the rest of us. Sure, he didn't go to a fancy college like Brandon or me, but he still got a solid education and worked his butt off to build a respectable life. Nick didn't go to the same type of fancy college as my brother, and I attended simply because he couldn't afford it. That's nothing to be ashamed of, but Brandon has always made it a point to bring it up, as if it somehow diminishes Nick's accomplishments. When Brandon spat out that insult about Nick being a dirty, illiterate cleaner, something inside me snapped. I completely lost it and started cursing him out. I didn't care who heard. I was beyond done with his behavior. I'm not proud to admit it, but I was on the verge of getting physical. Nick had to step in to calm me down, and Brandon, of course, tried to take a cheap shot at me by claiming I'd picked up Nick's language. The thing is, I wasn't embarrassed by Nick. Not one bit. What upset me was Brandon's nerve to say such vile things right in front of me, as if I'd just stand there and let it slide. By that point, the argument had gotten loud enough that my parents overheard. They came out to see what was going on. Once they figured out we were fighting, they asked Nick to take me home, promising they'd handle everything later. I'll admit, I was a little disappointed they didn't immediately start scolding Brandon. By now, they should have known that for me to be this upset, Brandon must have said something truly disgusting about Nick. But I guess, with guests in the house, they didn't want to make a scene or embarrass themselves further. So, Nick and I left. Once we got home, Nick worked to calm me down. I spent the next hour ranting about the whole thing, venting my frustration until I'd finally said all I needed to say. Afterward, I blocked Brandon on everything. I was still furious, but I realized that arguing with him was pointless. I couldn't change his mindset, and I was done trying. It was time to let him go. For good. I was also frustrated with my parents for not stepping in more firmly at the moment. But thankfully, I didn't block them. The next morning, they called me and asked me to come to my dad's office to sign some paperwork. The request caught me off guard, and when I asked what the paperwork was about, they didn't elaborate. Curiosity got the better of me, so I agreed to go. Even if the paperwork turned out to be nothing, I figured I'd at least get the chance to talk to my parents face-to-face. I went to my dad's office expecting to sort things out regarding Brandon. When I arrived, I was surprised to see my mom there too. Both of them looked unusually serious, and they didn't explain much at first. Instead, they handed me a stack of paperwork and asked me to read through it. They said if I agreed with what I saw, they wanted me to sign it right then and there. Curious, I started going through the documents, and I was floored. It was paperwork to begin the process of transferring ownership of my parents' law firm. To me, I couldn't believe it. For as long as I could remember, it had always been understood that Brandon would inherit the firm once my parents retired. He'd been working under my dad for years and was practically being groomed to take over. I needed to be absolutely sure. So I asked my dad if he was serious about leaving the firm to me instead of Brandon. Without hesitation, he said he was certain. After what had happened the night before, he had no intention of leaving anything to Brandon. To make it up to me and Nick, my parents decided the firm would go to me. This was a massive deal. I did go to law school and earn my degree, but I hadn't practiced law in 3 years. After just a year of working as a lawyer, I realized it wasn't for me and decided to follow my passion. Now, I run my own bakery, which is about as far from a law firm as you can get. Nick has a management job in his company, but he's not a lawyer either. Brandon, on the other hand, has been working in the family firm for years, fully expecting to inherit it. This news was going to hit him like a freight train. Asked my parents again if they were absolutely sure about this decision, and they assured me they were. After all the guests had left Brandon's Thanksgiving dinner, my parents confronted him and his wife about the commotion at the door with Nick and me. Apparently, Brandon and his wife didn't even try to downplay their behavior. They were completely casual about it, even openly justifying the horrible things they had said about Nick. It was as if they truly believed there was nothing wrong with how they treated us. Naturally, my parents were furious. They told Brandon and his wife to call us and apologize immediately, but I went to my dad's office expecting to have a conversation about Brandon and sort things out. But when I got there, I saw my mom was already present, and they both looked unusually serious. Neither of them explained anything right away. They just handed me some paperwork and asked me to review it. If I agreed with what was outlined, they wanted me to sign it immediately. I sat down with Nick and started reading through the documents. To my utter shock, it was paperwork to begin transferring ownership of my parents' law firm to me. For as long as I could remember, I thought Brandon was set to inherit the firm when my parents retired. Just to be sure, I asked my dad if this was actually what they intended. He confirmed it, saying that after what happened the night before, there was no way they'd leave the firm to Brandon. He went on to say that they wanted to make it up to Nick and me. Handing the firm over to me was their way of showing they no longer wanted any association with Brandon. This was a massive decision. While I do have a law degree, I haven't practiced law in 3 years. I left after just 1 year of practicing because I found it unfulfilling and decided to start my own business. These days, I run a bakery, which is a far cry from managing a law firm. Nick, on the other hand, works in management at his company, but he isn't a lawyer either. Brandon, however, had been working under my father for years and fully expected to take over the firm when the time came. This news was going to hit him hard. I asked my parents if they were absolutely certain about this decision, and they assured me they were. They explained that after all the guests left Thanksgiving night, they confronted Brandon and his wife about what had happened. According to my parents, Brandon and his wife didn't even bother to hide their awful behavior. They casually admitted to the horrible things they'd said about Nick, as if it was no big deal. Worse, they genuinely seemed to believe they'd done nothing wrong. This attitude infuriated my parents. They told Brandon and his wife to call Nick and me to apologize, but they outright refused. That was the breaking point for my parents. They decided then and there that they wanted nothing more to do with Brandon. Since they're nearing retirement, they still needed someone to take over the firm eventually. They decided that person should be me, their daughter, so the firm would stay in the family. Early the next morning, they came into work, drafted up the papers in a couple of hours using templates they'd originally prepared for Brandon, and presented them to me. After reading through the documents, I spoke to Nick privately, and together we decided to sign. It wasn't a decision we made lightly. My parents were excited and wanted to celebrate, but I didn't feel the same way. Even though I wanted to stand up for Nick and show Brandon he couldn't treat us like that, taking over the firm felt complicated. I wasn't passionate about practicing law. That's why I left in the first place. Brandon, on the other hand, loved his work and had been preparing to lead the firm for years. Taking that opportunity from him felt wrong, somehow. But then I reminded myself I wasn't stealing anything. My parents had made this decision and offered it to me. I was just accepting their offer. Still, the uneasiness lingered, and I couldn't fully shake it. Nick and I went home after signing, and we didn't talk much about it. Yesterday, however, my parents asked me to come to the firm since I'd need to start transitioning back into the business. When I arrived at the office, Brandon was there. It was the first time we'd come face-to-face since Thanksgiving. My parents made a formal announcement to the entire staff, declaring that I would be taking over the firm in a few months when they retired. The room went silent, and everyone just stared in confusion. As expected, the announcement didn't go over smoothly. The entire room fell silent when my parents revealed I would be taking over the firm. Most people had assumed Brandon was the obvious successor. Brandon didn't say anything publicly, but I could tell he was fuming. His expression gave him away. He looked like he was barely holding it together. I figured he didn't want to make a scene in front of everyone. Later that evening, after I'd gone home, Brandon called me. The number was unfamiliar, which I realized meant he'd used a burner phone. His tone was sharp and condescending, and he accused me of doing this intentionally to ruin him. He demanded that I stop our parents from leaving the firm to me. The entitlement in his voice set me off immediately. I told him I wasn't going to do any such thing. Our parents had made their decision, and if they believed I was capable of taking over, I wasn't going to refuse just to spare his feelings. I reminded him that he'd brought this situation on himself by being so awful to Nick and me, and that I didn't owe him anything. Then I told him point blank, I was taking over the firm. If he couldn't handle working under me, he was free to quit. That's when he lost it. Brandon started screaming, claiming that what I was doing was unethical. He even threatened to sue me and our parents, insisting I was destroying his future over a petty grudge. What really pushed me over the edge, though, was when he said that everything he'd said about Nick wasn't even untrue. That hit a nerve, and before I knew it, I was yelling right back at him. The call devolved into a full-blown shouting match, with both of us saying awful things we couldn't take back. Before hanging up, Brandon told me what I was doing to him was far more disgusting and pathetic than anything he'd done to me. He accused me of being selfish and unethical, and said he couldn't believe I would stoop so low. He ended by saying he'd resign if that's what I wanted, but he'd also make sure to sue us for being unfair to him. Even though I'm confident he doesn't have a legal leg to stand on, his words rattled me. I've been going over everything in my head ever since. Deep down, part of me feels conflicted. I don't think I'm doing anything wrong. I didn't ask for this, and it was our parents' decision. But I can't shake the nagging guilt that I've talked to Nick about it again and again, trying to sort through my feelings. As expected, the announcement of my taking over the law firm was met with silence and confusion. Everyone, myself included, had assumed Brandon would inherit it. Although he didn't say anything publicly, I could see the tension in his face. He was furious but must have decided against causing a scene in front of everyone. Later that evening, after Nick and I got home, Brandon called me. This time from a burner phone. He sounded angry and entitled, telling me that he knew I was doing this to spite him and that I needed to stop our parents from leaving the firm to me. The tone of his voice made my blood boil. I told him flat out that I wasn't going to do anything of the sort. Our parents had made the decision, and if they believed I was capable of taking over, why would I decline? Besides, Brandon had brought this upon himself with how horribly he'd treated Nick and me. I didn't feel the slightest bit guilty. I even told him that he'd have to deal with working under me, and if he couldn't handle that, he should quit now and save himself the trouble. That's when he completely lost it. He started yelling at me, calling me unethical, and threatening to sue me and our parents for destroying his future. He had the audacity to say that what he'd said about Nick wasn't even untrue, which pushed me over the edge. Before I knew it, we were in a full-blown screaming match, hurling insults and accusations at each other. By the end of the call, he told me that what I was doing was far more disgusting and pathetic than anything he'd done. He accused me of being selfish and unethical, said he'd quit if that's what I wanted, and promised to take legal action against us for being unfair. While I doubt he has any real legal grounds, his words left me shaken. Deep down, I know this isn't my fault, but hearing the devastation in his voice made me second-guess myself. Nick has reassured me repeatedly that I'm doing nothing wrong. My parents have said the same, emphasizing that Brandon's behavior left them no choice. Yet, I still can't shake the feeling that this doesn't sit right with me. I've been going over everything in my mind, trying to make sense of how I feel. I keep circling back to one thing. I never wanted to be a lawyer in the first place. I only went into law because it was what my parents wanted for me, and at the time, I didn't have any other ambitions. Now, things are different. I've built a bakery business from the ground up, and it's something I genuinely love doing. If I take over the firm, I'd have to give up the bakery. There simply wouldn't be enough time to manage both, and the thought of walking away from something that brings me so much happiness just to spite Brandon feels petty and wrong. When I shared my thoughts with Nick, he told me I shouldn't feel pressured to take over the firm. He suggested I talk to my parents and be honest about how I feel. But there's a catch. My parents are adamant that the firm must stay in the family. It's important to them, and I can't deny them that. The situation with Brandon and me has spiraled to a point where there's no repairing it. If I don't take over the firm, it'll go to Brandon, and that's something I'm absolutely not okay with. But I also feel stuck because I don't know how to express this to my parents without sounding petty. The idea of taking over the firm just to keep Brandon from inheriting it feels as childish as it does vindictive, and I hate feeling like I'm stooping to his level. Still, Nick has reassured me over and over that it's completely normal to feel conflicted. The history between Brandon and me, the resentment, and the lack of an apology, it's all added up to this boiling point. Even if Brandon did apologize now, it would feel hollow and insincere. So what's the point? That's where I've been stuck, unable to figure out how to communicate all of this to my parents. Update 2. I finally ripped the Band-Aid off. It's been 8 days since Thanksgiving, and I knew I couldn't let this drag on any longer. The longer I waited, the harder it would be to stop the process. So last night, I gathered my courage and invited my parents over for dinner to have the conversation I'd been avoiding. Nick was by my side, as always, and his presence gave me the confidence to get through it. When I told my parents I didn't want to take over the firm, their initial reaction was exactly what I expected. They were upset. They reminded me that I'd already signed the paperwork and said if I wasn't sure about it, I shouldn't have signed in the first place. They weren't wrong, and I sat through a lecture about indecisiveness without arguing back. Eventually, though, their tone softened. They started to understand my dilemma. They suggested I could take over ownership of the firm but step back from the legal operations entirely. That way, I'd still fulfill their wish to keep the firm in the family without having to involve myself in day-to-day legal work. But the truth is, I don't want to be involved at all, not in ownership, not in management, not in any capacity. I was completely honest with them, explaining that I found fulfillment in my bakery business, and the idea of stepping into a role at the firm just doesn't interest me. I tried to be as transparent as I could about how I felt. While they weren't thrilled about my decision, they did seem to understand. My parents weren't exactly thrilled with my decision, but they eventually accepted it. The tougher part, though, was explaining why I had agreed to take over the firm in the first place. I had to admit that my motivation wasn't exactly noble. I didn't want Brandon to inherit the firm. Hearing this genuinely surprised them. I've never been the kind of person to act out of pettiness or vindictiveness, but I'd reached my breaking point with Brandon. His behavior had been grating on me for years, and the Thanksgiving debacle was the final straw. I told my parents outright that I'd be furious if, after everything, Brandon still ended up running the firm. My parents listened carefully, and to my surprise, they understood where I was coming from. They even agreed that giving the firm to Brandon would send the wrong message. It would make them look weak, especially after they had publicly announced in the office that I was taking over. It wasn't just about family drama anymore. It was about maintaining trust and credibility with their employees. That said, their options were limited. They were adamant that the firm needed to stay in the family, but if I stepped away, Brandon was the only other option. And that came with a whole host of problems. For one, Brandon's behavior following the Thanksgiving incident had been nothing short of unprofessional. After our parents confronted him about what had happened, he ignored them for 3 days. During that time, he didn't show up to work, and the firm's operations suffered as a result. When he finally did return, my parents announced in front of the entire office that I would be taking over the firm. That must have been the final blow for him, because he stopped showing up altogether after that. He hasn't formally resigned, though, leaving everyone in a state of limbo. Their relationship with Brandon is now strained to the breaking point. Even if they wanted to offer the firm back to him, they're not sure he'd accept. And if he did, what would that say about their leadership? It would make them look weak and indecisive, which could erode trust among their employees. With Brandon seemingly out of the picture and me unwilling to take over, my parents are left in a difficult position. They're scrambling to figure out a solution that keeps the firm in the family while also maintaining their credibility. My parents and I had a difficult discussion about the future of the firm. They were adamant that the company should remain in the family, but I had to explain to them why I initially agreed to take over. Even though I didn't want the position, I told them the truth. I didn't want Brandon to inherit the firm after everything he'd done. This revelation took them by surprise because I've never been the type to act out of pettiness or revenge. But Brandon's behavior had been grating on me for years, and the Thanksgiving incident was the final straw that I made it clear that if, after all this, Brandon somehow ended up taking over the company, I would be deeply upset. My parents listened and said they understood my perspective. They agreed that it would reflect poorly on them if they reversed their decision and gave the company back to Brandon, especially after announcing my succession to the entire office. Doing so could damage their credibility and make them look weak and indecisive. But the problem remained. If neither Brandon nor I wanted the role, who would take over? My parents still felt strongly about keeping the firm in the family, even though the situation with Brandon had strained their relationship with him. After Thanksgiving, Brandon ignored our parents for 3 days, which caused issues at work. When he did return, they announced my succession. After that, he stopped showing up entirely, though he hasn't officially resigned. His behavior has been unprofessional, and it's clear that even if my parents were to ask him to take over again, there's no guarantee he'd accept. I tried suggesting that they consider some of the firm's most dedicated employees, people who had been loyal and hardworking for years. They had a couple of names in mind, but I could tell they weren't ready to let someone outside the family run the company they had built from the ground up. I didn't push the issue further during that conversation, knowing it would take time for them to come around. For now, I left it at that, though I was certain they'd eventually need to name an external successor. I felt guilty about putting them in such a difficult position, especially since my hasty decision to sign the paperwork had caused so much upheaval. At the same time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. Brandon had treated Nick and me horribly for years, not just at Thanksgiving, and it was about time someone held him accountable. He valued his position at the firm, but his arrogance and inability to apologize have cost him dearly. Even now, he hasn't apologized, and honestly, I don't even want it anymore. Update 2 weeks have passed since my last update, and I'm happy to share that my parents have officially named a new successor. He's one of the firm's most diligent employees and has been with them for years. No, he's not family, but he's practically like family at this point. Convincing my parents to choose someone outside the family wasn't easy. It took several long conversations and a lot of patience to get them to see that keeping the firm in the family wasn't necessarily the best option. Ultimately, I reminded them that there's no guarantee the firm will always stay within the family, and that's okay. I told my parents that it was better to choose someone outside the family now, while they could still control the situation, rather than cling to the hope that their grandchildren might want to become lawyers someday. If that didn't happen, the firm would eventually have to pass to an outsider anyway, and they'd have no say in who that person would be. This way, the choice would be theirs, and it would go to someone who genuinely wanted the position and had worked hard for it. I made it clear that I wasn't interested, Brandon didn't deserve it, and this was the only fair solution. It took them some time to come around, but eventually, they agreed. They've already spoken to their chosen successor and will be starting the paperwork soon, officially scrapping all plans that involve me. As for Brandon, a couple of days ago, he emailed our parents his resignation. In true Brandon fashion, he bragged about his plans to start his own law firm, proudly announcing that his in-laws were funding his ambitious project. He also promised we'd regret how we treated him. Honestly, shiver me timbers. I couldn't care less about what he does anymore. Whatever bond we had as siblings is gone, and I have no interest in repairing it. Nick and I are happy, and my parents are content with the decisions we've made. That's all that matters to me now. Of course, there are moments when I feel sad about how things have turned out. Brandon and I used to be so close as kids. There was a time when it felt like it was just the two of us against the world. But he's not that person anymore, and truthfully, neither am I. Nick is my priority now, and I refuse to tolerate anyone who insults or disrespects him. That goes for everyone, including my own family. So yes, I do feel bad about the way things have ended, but I don't regret anything I've done. People can call me petty or vengeful if they want, but I know the truth. I'm just trying to be a good partner to someone who deserves my loyalty and love.